I'm Pastor Michael Rogers, and if you've been with us so far, you know we're trying to deal with our frustration with the church today and figure out what it means to follow Jesus in the middle of this, to find a practical path forward inside and outside the church for us who are believers. If you're interested in that, then this is the show for you. Welcome to Filled to Empty.
For me to live is Christ, for me to die is gain. Every moment in between, there'll be joy and there'll be pain. I can't worry about the future or change a thing about my past. I've got this moment to believe, and I'm gonna make it last. I am filled to be emptied.
Today I'm sitting here in front of a church on K Street that's being torn down here in the middle of Ardmore, close to Commerce Street. And I know the pastor who was at the church before this. He was a Spanish language pastor, and he was a very good man, and he is still doing ministry here. The church is still doing ministry here. As a matter of fact, they lost the building because they got condemned, and that was through no fault of their own. It's just too much building and not enough church people to get it all taken care of. And so now the steeple is down, and if you come with me and just take a look around, you can see that they're having to tear the whole thing down. And today is our 6th episode of Filled to Empty, and we're talking about tension and what that tension is today. And I thought this was a perfect setting for us to talk about the thing that is probably tearing the church up the most. And it's the thing that we struggle with the most as frustrated believers. Those of us who have really taken the time to think about how the church can be fixed, but have done it through a motivation of frustration and put ourselves in a place where we accidentally have become part of the problem too. And that issue is forgiveness. We have gotten so far away from what God wants us to understand and accomplish in relationships that we have started to feel justified in holding grudges against the church in different ways. Whether it's a single church, whether it's people in the church, or whether it's the church in general, and we've just given up on it. We have put ourselves in a place of judgment upon the church without realizing that's what we're doing. Now, if it feels like I'm pointing a finger at you, just remember, if I have to point a finger at you, I'm pointing 3 back at myself. I have been in this place where I have torn at the roots of a church because of my unforgiveness. And so I'm not coming to you as a holier than thou person. I'm not coming to you trying to make a point that I think I know better than everyone else, except in this way. God has been working on my heart, and I'm tired of tearing down the church, and I'm tired of being a part of the problem. I want to see how to go forward. And so we're going to talk today about what it means to be the church. And we'll have a little different format today. We usually do tension and then filled and then emptied, and I try to break that up. But today, I'm just doing this short bit of tension because you know where I'm coming from. And then I'm going to do a lot of teaching on what God says about forgiveness. I love you, brother and sister. I love you, and I wish that I could be there with you, holding your hand and talking to you person to person, or just, manning up and chest out, and you and I just going at it together. Will you do me the honor of listening as we approach this topic of forgiveness? Sitting back here at the back door of the church because as a church leader, this is where I lost you. And we're out in the neighborhood, and you're going to hear sounds that are going on around me, and that's okay because I feel like this is where we've put ourselves. As we've started to approach what it looks like to be believers who love Jesus and are frustrated with the church, we've often put ourselves out past the back door, out into the world, and all of the barking and all of the noisy machinery and the traffic and everything else has kind of caught us up to the place where we still love Jesus, we still believe in Jesus, we still want to see His kingdom advance. We're just not sure where His kingdom is anymore, and we get more and more used to being out in this kind of area. And so I just recognize that this might be a different kind of episode, because as a pastor, I have felt exactly how you have felt, where there have been things that have been done that have ruined my ministry, or messed with my ministry, or just messed with my personal life, where I have had a difficult time letting it go. And I have a wife and kids who went through all of that, and they saw their dad treated what they believe is unfairly, and it affected them as well, and it affected all of our faith. And part of our journey is that we were hurt by people, and people that we counted as friends, people we counted as fellow partners in the ministry. The things that we thought were really important to both of us ended up being not as important as we thought, and there were mistakes made on both sides. But I noticed that it's always easier for me to justify my own mistakes than it is to forgive others for their mistakes. And so here we are at the back door of the church. Here we are amidst all the worldly noise. Here we are in everything that all the armor we put on ourselves to keep from being hurt by church again. And yet we have this God who loves us, this God who has forgiven us, this God who has brought us into a relationship with Him by bending over backwards for us, by forgiving us when we were unforgivable. And yet we cling to the things that were done to us by the church, by a church, by people in a church, by a person in the church. And so I just want to have a candid conversation with you, and I felt like this needed to be different. So here I am. It's my 6th episode. I'm Pastor Michael Rogers from Filled to Empty, and I'm letting you in on more than I intended to let you in on, because I believe this will help you. My wife and I moved into a place close to my hometown where we were able to do ministry, and for 6 years we did some amazing ministry. We had 1 year where we had 23 baptisms in a church of about 150, and it was an incredible time. There were people growing in Christ. We were reaching people. We had outreach programs. We had monthly children's programs that were out of this world. We really were clicking on all cylinders. We were revamping the building with money that we got from selling a piece of land, and everything seemed to be going well, but the money just kept getting tighter and tighter, and there were some decisions made in how to handle that money that caused me to have to be honest with our congregation and our leadership, and just let them know that we were running out of money. We needed to decide on what we were going to do about it. I really still don't know what happened, because very little talking was actually done to me. But at some point, I became the focus of everyone's belief that somehow my leadership had caused all this. My leadership had caused all of this, and I still don't understand it. But in the course of about a week, there was a 3-hour congregation meeting that I'll never forget. There was a lot of accusations flung my way. There were terrible things said about my character. I lost my ministry. I lost my reputation. I lost my home. Nearly lost my family. And I never lost my faith, but I lost a lot of the practice of it. And I found myself working at a warehouse in Amazon, in a fulfillment center. Angry enough that I didn't want anyone to, I was okay with people knowing I was a Christian. I didn't want anyone to know I was a pastor. And I went to headhunters, and I was, telling them these people have done me wrong, and I deserve to be in ministry. I know God has not released me from the ministry, so I'm ready to get back in. Just find me a church. And I had one headhunter just be honest with me and said, Michael, I know that you're saying this, none of this was your fault, and I believe you, but that doesn't change the fact that you're toxic right now. You've got to you've got to do something about it. You got to give yourself a break. And I was angry. We went to church because I knew my kids needed to see us going to church, and I went to work, lost half my salary, we had to move into a new place, and that meant we were coming out of a parsonage, so we suddenly had to pay rent. There was so much for me to be angry about and bitter about, and now I couldn't even get back into the ministry. And so now what do I do? And I was talking to a friend. I hope he listens to this or watches this one day. His name is Joe Knott, and he's a simple guy, hard worker, one of the nicest guys I've ever met. And he was talking to me, and he just got to know me well enough for me to admit that I was a pastor. And he says, well, where's your church? And I said, well, I don't have one anymore. And I started ranting and raving about church, just church in general. I was already frustrated with church before this happened. This just exacerbated it and brought all of it out like poison, like toxin. And I just started telling him everything about it. And I said, that's why I don't have a church. And he just took it. And at the end he said, well, Michael, have you ever wondered if maybe the reason that you don't have a church right now is because you're supposed to be our pastor here at Amazon? Such a simple faith, such a simple man. And he got right to the heart of me. And I heard God in what he was saying. And I realized that while I'm out in there in the world, my calling hasn't changed. While I'm out here in the world, no matter how much noise is happening, I am still called to be a minister of God. And so I should start right away. But I still wasn't ready to forgive until a few months later, the following Easter. And but I have to be honest with you, I still wasn't ready to forgive. I was really struggling with this. I didn't know how to go forward. I knew that I should. I knew that God in his word tells me often that it's important for me to forgive, that I should forgive as God has forgiven me, and I still struggled with it until we got to an Easter service, and my friend was preaching, Neil Krause at Forward Church, and he said, we're going to talk about Jesus on the cross today. We're going to talk about when he said these words, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And we're going to talk about who he was forgiving and when he was forgiving them. And I remember it's the first time in church that I understood what it felt like to be that guy who sat back and folded his arms and I'm not gonna listen to this. And he gave it to me both barrels. You know, Jesus forgave those who crucified him as they were crucifying him. He didn't wait for them to ask for forgiveness. He didn't wait for them to say, I'm sorry. He didn't wait for them to get their comeuppance. He didn't wait until there was vengeance. He didn't send anyone to hell. He just forgave them. And I can't imagine that kind of power. I can't imagine that kind of grace. And so I still sat there with my arms folded. But it just so happened that this was a Sunday, rare Sunday, with all of my kids growing up, where all of my kids were in town and everybody was there. And my girls went down and my son went down, and my wife and I just couldn't for a while. The pastor's wife went down and ministered to our kids, and it was terrible. It was terrible. We still were not ready to go, but eventually the song got to us and God broke our hearts, and we went down at the altar. And I don't know that we actually fully 100% forgave anyone that day. What I know is that forgiveness began in our hearts that day. And it's a funny thing. All of this time, it had been, it had been 7-8 months since I had lost my job as a preacher. And all of this time, I was not hearing from anyone anything about any opportunities for preaching. I'd had a few interviews, I had a few things happen, but mostly they were just mentors who were being good to me, and churches that I really didn't deserve, and then nothing, no preaching, nothing. And when we went down that 2 weeks before Easter, and we said, "Okay, God, we're gonna forgive them," I started getting preaching opportunities right and left. I preached in a different place about every other week from that time until about August, when I found our new church up in northern Indiana. Finally, about, well, it was a year after everything had gone down, a church in northern Indiana gave me an opportunity, and I was able to go up there, and I didn't even know if I really wanted the job. I was going up there and I was going to tell them like it was, tell them who I was and what I was about, and I gave them all 4 barrels. We had hours of interviews, and I realized that this was the place God was calling me to. And then I heard the story of the pastor who was there before, how he'd been there for 38 years, and how 2 weeks before Easter, on the same Sunday that my family was down at the altar, he had given his 2-week notice after 38 years. And we realized that God was doing something here. And so I started working at the church, and they helped to heal me. That church will always be special to me because they helped to heal me. Even after all of that, I don't know that I was really healed, because when I would talk to the staff about this new church, I would say, your church has these issues. Your leadership is doing this. Your elders will do this and this and this. And I was probably there for 3 or 4 months before one day in a staff meeting, I said something about our church, and the staff literally erupted in applause. They were so excited because they recognized that a change had happened in my heart, and I was suddenly at least willing to trust them well enough to identify myself with them. That's how badly everything hurt. That's how bitter it got inside of me. That's how rough it was, that even as God had put me back into the ministry, even as I was able to say, I'm ready to go, Lord, let's do this thing, and even as an eldership was ready to trust me with it, I was still so broken that I couldn't identify with the church that I was leading. But God dealt with me, and He helped me through that. And over the course of time, I began to learn that forgiveness is not a moment. It's not an event. Forgiveness is a process. And so I started going through the process. So listen, if you've been hurt by the church, I understand how you feel. I understand what that feels like. And I know how hard it is and how long it takes to get back to that place where you can trust church people again. I remember one of my daughters saying, I just don't know if when I go to church, and I get around church people, I just don't know how to act. And I said, well, I'd gotten to the place where I could finally say to her, well, when you go to church, don't look for church people. Just look for people. Because I noticed that we didn't have any trouble going to the gym or going to a restaurant or going to a store and allowing people to have their faults. We didn't have any problem joining some clubs and having some hobbies and things like that where people didn't necessarily always act the right way. And we had friends and family who sure weren't acting like saints all the time, and yet we were able to forgive them. Why were we treating church people differently? And over the course of time, it got easier. It's still not easy. There are still people I know that I have to talk to God about often because I have a hard time forgiving them for what happened. But I recognize that I'm the only one that's held hostage by that. These people probably don't even think of me anymore. They probably don't have any idea that it still affects me the way that it does. And it's been years now. And I'm in a new place. I'm in a new state, a new place, and a new ministry, and there's no reason for it to affect me. But sometimes when I'm on my own and I see something similar to what happened there, it still grips my heart a little bit. So I want to share some things with you. I just noticed this in the scripture one time, and God showed it to me. Whether you believe these things or not, God showed it to me in a dream that I was supposed to look at Genesis 4, and I did. And so it's the old story of Cain and Abel. And Cain and Abel were the first offspring of Adam and Eve. And Cain was the firstborn, and he loved to deal with animals. And Abel was the secondborn, and he loved to deal with the crops and things. And when it came time to worship God, Abel brought the first fruits of his crops. Cain just brought some animals. And God condoned the gift of Abel, but not the gift of Cain. And Cain killed his brother. Now, as soon as God called him on it, Cain was like, oh no, because he understood how the human heart worked. If people hear about this, they're going to want to take revenge on me. And so God said, I'll put a mark on you so that if anybody does anything to you for what you've done to Abel, I will do to them 7 times. And then we follow through Cain's ancestry until we get to Lamech. And Lamech, later in Genesis chapter 4, I think this is partly showing just how far they were starting to get away from God. Why? Cain had been offended by God and by Abel. He had killed Abel for it, and then he had gone away from God. But he never really came back to God, it doesn't look like, because by the time we get down to Lamech, Lamech is the first man to have 2 wives. And he evidently he was offended by a man, and the man, I don't know if the man punched him or something happened, and Lamech responded by killing the man. And he went to his wives and he said, I just want you to know that this happened. But if Cain was avenged 7 times, then let Lamech be avenged 77 times. And I don't think God ever told Lamech that. I think Lamech either meant one of 2 things. Either he was calling God to give him even more protection than Cain because he knew man's heart, or he was so sure of himself that he was like, I don't even need God. If somebody hurts me, I'm going to get them times 77. Either way, what it showed was the debilitation of the heart to forgive and to be forgiven. And Lamech then sets the table for us, which I find interesting because in Luke chapter 17, Jesus is talking to the disciples, and he tells them basically that, if a man offends you, you forgive him. If you have to forgive him 7 times, you forgive him. And the disciples are amazed. They're surprised. They're like, 7 times? Are you kidding? We're going to need help with our faith in order to increase our faith. Help us with this. And I bring that up because later, Matthew chapter 18, Jesus is talking about how to reconcile with your brother in Matthew chapter 18. He's telling you, leave your gift at the altar, go to your friend, settle the accounts. And if that doesn't work, bring a friend with you to settle the account. And if that doesn't work, then bring the church. But the whole idea is reconciliation, not discipline. And Peter is so excited. He's like, I recognize this lesson. And so he jumps in Matthew 18, verses 21 and 22. And Peter jumps in and he says, Lord, how many times should I forgive my brother? 7 times? He had missed the point of the lesson, but he remembered the lesson, and that was a good thing, right? And Jesus said, in some versions it says, and Jesus said, no, I tell you, you forgive him 70 times 7. But there are some other versions that say 77 times. I tend toward the 77 times. And the reason is because I think that Jesus had in his mind the story of Cain and Lamech. And he was reversing where Cain and Lamech were under the law and where they believed that vengeance was important. Then being avenged 7 times or 77 times was how justice happened. But under Jesus, it was not just 7 times, but 77 times that you forgave someone in a day for the things that they had done. Jesus begins to show us that forgiveness is a better option than vengeance. And the reason is because vengeance was never ours. It was never our job to judge, and it was never our job to get justice or revenge. That's what we have God for. And that's why we can forgive people. And that's why Jesus said some crazy things. If someone strikes your cheek, turn to him the other cheek also. Someone tells you that you have to go with him a mile, go 2 miles. Somebody takes your tunic, give him his robe as well. That whole idea is based on the fact that a God who forgave you that much also gives you the power to forgive the people you don't think you can forgive, so that you don't have to go out the back door of the church, so that you don't have to hold it against every single church person that there are some people in a church that hurt you. That bitterness and resentment can lead to frustration, and that motivation then pulls us away from what we have to do for God and puts us in a position where we are no longer fruitful or effective in the way that we follow Jesus. So I hope you're hearing this. When Jesus was on the cross, Luke 23, and he said, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do," he set a precedent. And if you look at the end of Acts chapter 7, you will find Stephen, the first martyr. And even as he sees heaven open up for him as they're stoning him, he asks God to forgive them for what they've done. I wasn't stoned. I wasn't crucified. I was wrongly accused in some ways. Some poor decisions on my count were counted as sin. Aspersions were cast upon my character. Nothing compares to what I've done to cause Christ to die on the cross. I am filled by his forgiveness. Who am I to refuse to empty it for others? I don't know what that looks like 100% because I'm still learning how to do it myself. But listen to me. You cannot be effective for the church while holding bitterness in your heart. What does it mean to forgive? It means that the debt you are owed, whatever you think that debt is, that they say they're sorry, that they get their comeuppance, that they get treated the same way, that they lose their faith, that they lose relationships that they don't deserve, that they lose leadership positions that they shouldn't have. Whatever that debt is that you think they owe, leave that to God. Put your gift on the altar, your pride, your judgment, your anger, your frustration. Leave that on the altar. Go to God and ask him if he would allow his Holy Spirit to work on you and I so that we can learn how to forgive. And when we are filled with the grace and truth of Jesus Christ, and we begin emptying that grace and truth out on everyone around us, even if they've hurt us, our hearts will begin to heal. And then we will be ready to make disciples. I'm Pastor Michael Rogers. Thank you for listening to this tough episode of Filled to Empty.